forces backed by Russian air power have recaptured the ancient city of Palmyra.
حيث العربي والسوري تقدموا في عمق تدمر ينسلع عن إرهابي إذاعة متحطمة الصهيونات.
Теперь Сирия, восстановление древней Пальмира, освобожденная от террористов, ничего может быть.
Propaganda coup for the Syrian President Assad.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. These are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. Syria. Outside forces are involved. Various news narratives are now in play. The Turkish government sees media enemies all over the place, including Berlin and Washington. President Obama goes to Cuba to rewrite the story of the Cold War. But are those reporting the story still reading from an old script? And a PR disaster that the Twitter sphere is making a meal out of. Scroll back about a year to May 2015, when the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra was captured by ISIL. The headlines at the time foreshadowed worst-case scenarios for the people of the city and the Roman ruins there, which are treasured, listed as World Heritage Sites by the United Nations. However, late last month, when Syrian government forces backed by Russian warplanes liberated the city, Western news outlets gave that story short shrift. Despite the blow taken by ISIL, what that means for the wider war there, plus the securing of the Roman ruins that remain intact. The contrast with the coverage from Russian-sponsored outlets could not be more obvious. Domestic media there, as well as international outlets like RT and Sputnik, gave the story extensive, exuberant treatment, making the case that Palmyra may serve to vindicate President Putin's intervention in a war for which the West, as the Russians like to say, has run out of answers. The divergent news narratives would have come as no surprise to the president himself. Putin's spokesman told Russian state TV that the Kremlin is fighting an information war with what he calls the Anglo-Saxon media. The Palmyra story, the differing coverage in the West, Russia, and the region, provides a user's guide to what is at stake here in geopolitical terms. Our starting point this week is a city whose existence was first documented back in the 2nd century BC, Palmyra. May 2015, Palmyra falls to forces of the Islamic State. Given some of the initial images, decapitated bodies in the streets, and the historical significance of the city, fears of looming disasters, both humanitarian and archaeological, were expressed on the airwaves loudly, clearly.
And now this treasure stands at the mercy of an army of marauding nihilists.
But when Syrian government forces, backed by Russian air power, took the city back, the coverage from certain quarters was markedly different in tone and proportion.
This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the defeat of the terrorist organization that still controls plenty of territory in both Syria and Iraq.
This is a real challenge for governments and media close to governments that are critical of the Russians and the Assad regime, because they can't deny the fact that ISIS was driven out of Palmyra by the combined forces of the Syrian government and the Russians. They can't just ignore it, they can't deny it, because it's on every media in the world.
The Western media is not different really from the Arabic media when it comes to the Syrian conflict. Traditionally, the Western media are aligning with the regimes, whether in America or here in Britain or elsewhere in Europe. Media outlets, whether in the Arab world or in the Western world, they have agreement that there has to be a defeat for ISIS. ISIS has to be eliminated. But there's a disagreement on the way that this elimination has to happen.
What they do is they report it very matter-of-factly, and they sometimes will add to that by saying that there's a lot of areas in the region where Daesh or ISIS is operating and the Syrian government is not attacking them.
يسوق النظام السوري استعادتها من تنظيم الدولة كمهمة إنقاذ مقدسة.
So they try to minimize the commitment of the Syrian government and the Russians to actually fight ISIS everywhere.
Contrast that with what's been beaming out of Russia. News channels funded by the state, some of which are seen as thinly disguised propaganda outlets for the Kremlin, have been able to report accurately, indisputably, that Russian warplanes helped drive everyone's public enemy number one, ISIL, out of Palmyra.
Путин, безусловно, следил за ходом боев за бесценный культурный шедевр мировой величины и всеми силами приближал победу.
And to the journalists who cover the victors go the spoils. Russian news teams embedded with Syrian government troops were able to get to the city and the images before other non-Russian news outlets could.
Russian media does tend to get better access from the Assad regime to some of the front lines, and that allows them, of course, to show sides of the conflict that others aren't able to. Access has always come with a price in a lot of these cases where it's tightly controlled, and that is, of course, to subtly, if not more directly, promote the view of the regime or of the individual or institutional organization granting that access.
The Russian media is stressing that this is indeed the World Heritage Site and something that is being done for the whole of humanity. It's really not possible to continue with the same narrative that many Western media try to peddle, and that is, again, tyrant fighting against democracy. It's pretty evident that what Assad has been fighting against are the same people who Western intelligence and agencies and police are now fighting against.
Russian media, through the Kremlin-backed RT, which operates globally and is very prolific in the English language, has taken a particularly slanted view of the conflict in Syria.
We would like to thank President Putin, who's helped our army against all the countries that support Islamic State.
The fall of Palmyra, in that respect, is a great propaganda coup for outlets such as RT, because it allows them to fuel this narrative, this false narrative, that they're at the forefront of helping Assad and therefore the world combat the scourge of Islamic State. In reality, the Russians, like the Assad regime, are part of the problem.
Whether that is true or not, it is the kind of perception of Russia that the Kremlin has been trying to change through its soft power media push that began with the launch of RT's English language channel in 2005 and many more channels broadcasting in multiple languages since. And this past week, President Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, went on domestic television and pulled no punches about the war of words and images Russia is now in and who the Kremlin considers to be the enemy.
Мы находимся в состоянии информационной войны с законодательными информационного поля мирового. Именно англосаксонские СМИ, средства массовой информации. И вот с ними мы находимся в состоянии войны.
In this information war, Moscow has many adversaries. One advantage it does hold, however, is the amount of control it wields over its news media. Compared to media outlets in the West that have commercial imperatives to deal with and tend to echo political narratives on Syria written in Washington and London.
For them, this is all about Russia's hubris, Russia's international glory.
Today, the deadly roar of Russian air power.
Whereas I think Russians are a little bit more down to earth when it comes to matters like this, and Western media coverage is in a flux. I think the story is changing, and part of the reason is because the Western diplomacy, the Western policy on Syria is changing, and many media outlets are sort of catching up with that.
Russians are probably invested in this in a much more patient, long-term manner. The Americans, on the other hand, have a much shorter time frame. They think in terms of this year, this American news cycle, when there's competition from the American presidential elections. There's a lot of things in the U.S. right now, and therefore the American and Western media coverage, broadly speaking, tends to be focused on let's fix this problem and let's get out of here. Whereas the Russians are saying, build up long-term relationships and strengthen the strategic advantage that Russia has. Those approaches are very different from each other, and the media, I think, captures a lot of that in this instance.
On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the coverage of the story in Syria.
The Western and the Russian press have covered events in Palmyra quite differently. The Russian press refers to the liberation of Palmyra. The Western press refers to the recapture of Palmyra. The Russian press sees the return of Palmyra to Assad regime control as a good thing. The Western press sees the return of Palmyra to Assad regime control as not such a good thing.
On average, Western media doesn't seem to have some sort of significant bias against Russian involvement. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova accused London in attempting to dismiss the part played by Damascus and Moscow in their fight against terror. However, those claims mainly come from English services of the Russia Today, and it seems that they're trying to support this narrative that Western media are against Russian involvement.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Having intimidated a number of news outlets in Turkey, the government there seems to think it can do the same with journalism conducted in other countries. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan was in Washington this week and was due to make a speech at the Brookings Institution, a think tank, when his security team roughed up a number of journalists trying to cover the event. Organizers said they came close to canceling the speech before the Turkish embassy reportedly intervened and told the Turkish security guards to back down. The National Press Club issued a statement saying Turkey's leader and his security team are guests in the United States. They have no right to lay their hands on reporters or those exercising the rights they have in this country. That incident followed what happened in Germany. This 2-minute satirical video went to air on the publicly owned broadcaster NDR. It skewered Erdogan over many issues, including his tight grip on the Turkish media.
Ein Journalist, der was verfasst, dass Erdogan nicht passt, ist morgen schon im Knast.
According to a report in Der Spiegel, after that video went to air, Germany's ambassador to Ankara was summoned by the Turkish government, which demanded an explanation for the broadcast. Tayyip Erdogan likes to say that the media in Turkey are amongst the freest in the world. Meanwhile, the government recently raided and replaced the management of an opposition newspaper, Zaman, and Erdogan has vowed that Cumhuriyet journalists Can Dündar and Erdem Gül, who are currently facing terrorism-related charges, will pay with jail time for their critical reporting on the government. In China, the government of Xi Jinping has been stepping up scrutiny and control over the media, both mainstream and online. So, when an open letter started doing the rounds on the internet calling for the president's resignation, that provoked a response from the authorities. The letter first appeared on Wuji News, a Chinese website, on March 4th. It was signed anonymously by, quote, loyal Communist Party members and criticized Xi for abandoning collective leadership, concentrating power in his own hands, and failed economic and foreign policies. 16 people involved with that site have since been arrested. Then last week, Wen Yunchao, a blogger and government critic based in New York, said police in southern China took 3 of his family members into custody. Then, on March 27th, an exiled dissident journalist, Chan Ping, who was based in Germany, reported that 3 of his siblings in China had also been arrested. That happened after Ping, who writes for the German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, published an article critical of the arresting of Chinese journalists. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia convicted Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic last week of war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentencing him to 40 years in prison. Then the court jailed one of its own. French journalist Florence Hartmann covered the war in the Balkans before going to work for the court as a spokeswoman for the tribunal's ex-prosecutor Carla Del Ponte between 2000 and 2006. She left that job and wrote a book in which she revealed details of agreements made between the court and the Serbian government to keep information implicating the Serbian state in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre from the public eye. The court, the ICTY, then convicted Hartmann of contempt of court and fined her, a fine that Hartmann apparently refused to pay. She was at the court for the Karadzic proceedings when she was taken into custody last week for failing to pay the fine before being released 5 days later. At least 5 other journalists have been convicted by the Yugoslavia tribunal, fined up to 10,000 euros and jailed for as long as 3 months for publishing names of protected witnesses or disclosing testimony from closed sessions of the court. Barack Obama's visit to Cuba last week, the first by a sitting U.S. president in almost 90 years, is the latest step in a gradual diplomatic thaw between the two countries. The visit, so rich in symbolic value, got a lot of play in the U.S. news media. But for many Cubans, the tone and the framing of that coverage exposed some cliches that said more about the American media's preconceptions about Cuba than it said about the story itself. Cuba's own state media coverage, and the state controls every major news outlet on that island, was suspicious both of the U.S. and of domestic voices calling for reform. So it, too, played to type. However, the normalization process is just that. It's a process. It will continue. And as it unfolds, media from both sides of the ideological divide have narratives in need of updating. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the blind spots and tunnel vision that come with reporting on and from Cuba.
It was the week that Cuba, the island isolated for so long, was pushed into the international spotlight. An historic visit from the US President Barack Obama.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas.
After more than half a century of restricted access, the US media arrived in hordes, ready to report on the latest chapter in the Cuban-US détente. And as press conferences go, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Obama and Cuban President Raúl Castro agreeing to take questions from the US media, broadcast live on TV.
Why do you have Cuban political prisoners? ¿Y por qué no los suelta?
Dame la lista ahora mismo de los presos políticos para soltarlos. Dime el nombre o los nombres. Y si hay esos presos políticos, antes de que llegue la noche van a estar sueltos.
But in the age of the digital revolution, time waits for no man. Within minutes, lists of names appeared all over social media.
Lo esencial de ese momento fue
What's most important was the speed of responses, which nowadays is very different to when Raúl Castro was 20, or even 40 for that matter. Today, responses come quicker, but they aren't necessarily correct, because there were all sorts of numbers posted on social media.
En las redes han aparecido cualquier cifra.
How many political prisoners does the United States hold in Cuba, in the Guantanamo naval base turned prison? I think the latest figure is 91. So the United States holds more political prisoners in Cuba than the Cubans do, but I haven't seen that mentioned anywhere in the press coverage.
And it wasn't just political coverage. Sports fell into the same trap. When Obama and Castro took in a baseball game in Havana, ESPN, the US-based sports network, televised the game and threw in this tweet for good measure, making the point that there is poverty in the shadow of the stadium. And once again, it took Twitter to show the images ESPN could tweet out from places like New York, Atlanta, Detroit, but never does.
ESPN, as one of the major medias in the United States, was just promoting the anti-Cuban propaganda. It's not that they can't put it into context, but they won't. And if you put it in context, then the American media can see that, wait a minute, there's this huge embargo against Cuba that was established in the early 1960s and has caused so much damage.
You know, the embargo has also been used by the Cuban government as an excuse to crack down on bloggers and independent journalists, and has played well in the hands of the Cuban government in terms of restricting civil liberties and media freedoms.
Civil liberties, media freedoms, human rights, these have historically been the issues around which the US mainstream media have constructed their Cuba narrative. The Washington Post, which has been skeptical of Obama's diplomatic mission from the off, and the Miami Herald, much of whose readership is the anti-Castro Cuban-American exile community. Both papers ran multiple op-eds in the run-up to the visit, accusing the president of conceding too much too soon. We asked the papers to respond to criticism that coverage on Cuba's political system was disproportionate. The response from Fred Hyatt, editorial page editor at The Post: I don't believe there's such a thing as devoting too much attention to the issues of freedom and human rights.
Any media that contributes to the image of polarization that is shown from in other countries about Cuba is a media that is coming with some preconceived idea, and it's not going to help the people. Also, any media that tries to show Cuba like a country with black or white, like a country with only extremes, is a media that is not helping to find solutions.
For a North American in general and a journalist in particular, it is quite complicated to understand Cuban reality because they're very different countries. For a Cuban journalist, the story is about lifting the embargo. For a North American journalist, the angle is human rights. These are two very different perspectives. In Cuba, we have a saying that says it all. The bartender thinks in a way, and a drunk person thinks in another.
The Castros and Cuba's aversion to the so-called free press goes way back to 1954 in Guatemala, when a CIA-funded coup deposed the democratically elected president of that country. Che Guevara was there. He saw how central a CIA-funded clandestine radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, or Voice of Liberation, was to that outcome. In 1959, Guevara told a Colombian journalist, "Newspapers are the instruments of the oligarchy. We have to get rid of all newspapers because you can't have a revolution with press freedom." Cuban media has borne the brunt of that. The state controls all mainstream news outlets and is accused of paranoia. But there are reasons to back that up. In addition to CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, there's been an information war. In the 1980s, Radio and TV Martí, a US-funded broadcaster, was set up in Miami from where it beamed anti-Castro messages into Cuba. In 2010, the US government developed a secret social media program called Zunzuneo, or Cuban Twitter, to foment anti-government protests, a so-called Cuban Spring. And it wasn't even the CIA's idea, it was USAID's, the foreign aid body that is supposed to administer the humanitarian side of American foreign policy.
From the earliest days of the revolution, the American media portrayed Cuba and the Castro revolution in the most negative ways it could.
These rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers.
So the Cuban government has to be constantly vigilant against these programs, against these propaganda attempts by the American government to help overthrow the Cuban government.
The United States have to clarify if this new approach is to put the future in our hands, or is just another way, another strategy to overthrow the government. If the Cubans want to keep the government, to improve it, or to overthrow them, it's our decision. It's not a decision that can be made from another country.
So I think a decrease in US hostility should lead to an opening of space. It's certainly not the only thing that can and has done that, though. I think it started well before the opening with the United States, and I think it will continue, and I hope that the opening with the United States contributes to that.
So now you're going to have increased amounts of American journalists covering different things about Cuba. The message that's been controlled for decades by the American media is no longer the only message you're going to see. And hopefully the new message is going to be based more on reality of what's happening in Cuba and an exploration of what the revolution really is and not being controlled entirely by the mainstream media.
Finally, after the Brussels attacks last week, there was a tweet that came out of London. It went viral for all the wrong reasons after being posted by a public relations executive named Matthew Doyle. He said that he had just confronted a random Muslim woman on the street and challenged her to explain what happened in Brussels. Her response was, "Nothing to do with me." Doyle called that a mealy-mouthed reply. Twitter users then made a mockery of him. Doyle, a PR guy, somehow failed to see how his tweet would play out. He was then briefly arrested for inciting racial hatred before being freed. But a mealy-mouthed reply has since become a meme, with all kinds of people demanding all kinds of explanations for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with anybody. We've compiled a few for your consideration. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.